The emperor wished afterwards to do some exercise. He wrote some sentences which were dictated to him and translated them into English with the assistance of a little table, which I made for him, of the auxiliary verbs and articles, and aided by the dictionary for other words, which I made him look out himself. I explained to him the rules of syntax and grammar according as they came before us. In this manner he formed various sentences, which amused him more than the versions which we also attempted. After the lesson, at 2 o'clock, we went and took a walk in the garden. Several musket shots were fired. They were so near us that they appeared to have been fired in the garden itself. The emperor observed to me that my son, we thought it was he, seemed to have good sport. I replied that it was the last time he should enjoy it so near the emperor. "Really," said he, "you may as well go and tell him that he is only to come within cannon shot of us." I ran. We had accused him wrongfully, for the guns were fired by the people who were training the emperor's horses. After dinner, during coffee, the emperor, taking me to the corner of the chimney-piece, put his hand upon my head to measure my height and said, "I am a giant to you. Your Majesty is that to so many others," I observed to him, "that I am not at all affected by it." He spoke immediately of something else, for he does not like to dwell on expressions of this description: our daily habits, conversation with Governor Wilkes, armies, chemistry, politics, remarks on India, Delphine, by Mad, de Staël, Necker, Calonne. 18th, 20th. We led a life of great uniformity. The emperor did not go out in the mornings. The English lesson was very regularly taken about 2 o'clock, then followed either a walk in the garden or some presentations, but which were very rare, afterwards a little excursion in the calash, as the horses were at last arrived. Before dinner, we proceeded with the revision of the campaigns of Italy or Egypt. After dinner, we read romances. On the 20th, the emperor received Governor Wilkes, with whom he had a profound discussion on the army, the sciences, government, and the Indies. Speaking of the organization of the English army, he dwelt much on the principles of promotion therein, expressing his surprise that in a country where equality of rights is maintained, soldiers so seldom become officers. Colonel Wilkes admitted that the English soldiers were not formed to become so, and said that the English were equally astonished at the great difference they had remarked in the French army, where almost every soldier showed the nascent talents of an officer. "That," observed the emperor, "is one of the great results of the conscription. It had rendered the French army the best constituted that ever existed. It was an institution," he continued, "eminently national and already strongly interwoven with our habits. It had ceased to be a cause of grief except to mothers, and the time was at hand when a girl would not have listened to a young man who had not acquitted himself of this debt to his country. And it would have been only when arrived at this point," added he, "that the conscription would have manifested the full extent of its advantages. When the service no longer bears the appearance of punishment or compulsory duty, but is become a point of honor on which all are jealous, then only is the nation great, glorious, and powerful. It is then that its existence is proof against reverses, invasions, even the hand of time. Besides," continued he, "it may be truly said that there is nothing that may not be obtained from Frenchmen by the excitement of danger. It seems to animate them. It is an inheritance they derive from their Gallic predecessors." WCW. Courage, the love of glory are with the French, an instinct, a kind of sixth sense. How often in the heat of battle has my attention been fixed on my young conscripts rushing for the first time into the thickest of the fight, honor and valor bursting forth at every pore. After this, the emperor, knowing that Governor Wilkes was well informed in chemistry, attacked him on that subject. He spoke of the immense progress in all our manufactures occasioned by this science. He said that both England and France undoubtedly possessed great chemists, but that chemistry was more generally diffused in France and more particularly directed to useful results, that in England it remained a science, while in France it was becoming entirely practical. The governor admitted that these observations were perfectly correct, and, with a liberality of sentiment, added that it was to him, the emperor, that all these advantages were owing, and that wherever science was led by the hand of power, it would produce great and happy effects upon the well-being of society. The emperor observed that of late France had obtained sugar from the beetroot, as good and cheap as that extracted from the sugar-cane. The governor was astonished. He had not even suspected it. The emperor assured him that it was an established fact, opposed as it was to the rooted prejudices of all Europe, France itself not excepted. He added that it was the same with woad, the substitute for indigo, and with almost all the colonial produce except the dyewoods. This led him to conclude that if the invention of the compass had produced a revolution in commerce, the progress of chemistry bade fair to produce a counter-revolution. The conversation then turned to the present numerous emigrations of the artisans of France and England to America. The emperor observed that this favoured country grew rich by our follies. The governor smiled and replied that those of England would occupy the first place in the list, from the numerous errors of administration which had led to the revolt and subsequent emancipation of the colonies. The emperor said that their emancipation was inevitable, that when children had come to the size of their fathers, it was difficult to retain them long in a state of obedience. They then spoke of India. The governor had resided there many years and had filled high situations. He had made important researches. He was enabled to reply to a multitude of questions proposed to him by the emperor, respecting the laws, the manners, the usages of the Hindus, the administration of the English, the nature and construction of the existing laws. The English are governed according to the laws of England, the natives by local acts made by the several councils in the service of the company, with whom it is a fundamental principle to render them as nearly similar as possible to the laws of the people themselves. Hyder Ali was a man of genius. Tipu, his son, was arrogant, ignorant, and rash. The former had upwards of 400,000 men, the latter scarcely ever more than 50,000. These people are not deficient in courage, but they do not possess our physical strength, and have neither discipline nor any knowledge of tactics. 47,000 men in the English service, of whom only 4,000 were Europeans, were sufficient to destroy the empire of Mysore. It was, however, to be presumed that sooner or later the national spirit would rescue these regions from the dominion of the Europeans. The intermixture of European blood with that of the natives was producing a mixed race whose numbers and disposition certainly prepared the way for a great revolution. Nevertheless, in their actual condition, the people were happier than they had been previously to the dominion of the English, an impartial administration of justice, and the mildness of the government were, for the present, the strongest supports of the power of the parent state. It was also considered expedient to prohibit the English and other Europeans from buying lands there or forming hereditary establishments. Madame de Staël's Delphine was at this time a subject of conversation at our evening parties. The emperor analysed it. Few things in it escaped his censure. The irregularity of mind and imagination which pervades it excited his criticism. There were throughout, said he, the same faults which had formerly made him keep the author at a distance, notwithstanding the most pointed advances and the most unremitting flattery on her part. No sooner had victory immortalized the young general of the army of Italy than Madame de Staël, unacquainted with him from the mere sympathy of glory, instantly professed for him sentiments of enthusiasm worthy of her own Corinne. She wrote him long and numerous epistles, full of wit, imagination, and metaphysical erudition. It was an error, she observed, arising only from human institutions that could have united him with the meek, tranquil Madame Bonaparte. It was a soul of fire like hers, Madame de Staël's, that nature had undoubtedly destined to be the companion of a hero like him. I refer to the campaigns in Italy to show that this forwardness on the part of Madame de Staël was not checked by the circumstance of meeting with no return. With a perseverance never to be disheartened, she succeeded at a later period in forming some degree of acquaintance so far even as to be allowed to visit, and she used this privilege, said the emperor, to a disagreeable extent. It is unquestionably true, as has been reported, that the general, wishing to make her sensible of it one day, caused her to be told by way of excuse that he was scarcely dressed, and that she replied promptly and earnestly that it was unimportant, for that genius was of no sex. From Madame de Staël we were naturally led to her father, M. Necker. The emperor related that at Geneva, in his way to Marengo, he received a visit from him, wherein he made known, in an awkward manner enough, his desire to be admitted again to the administration, a desire by which Miss Calonne, his rival, subsequently came to Paris to express with a degree of levity beyond conception. M. Necker afterwards wrote a dangerous work upon the policy of France, which he attempted to prove could no longer exist either as a monarchy or a republic, and in which he called the first consul l'homme nécessaire. The first consul proscribed the work, which, at that time, might have been highly prejudicial to him, and committed the task of refuting it to the consul Lebrun, who, in his elegant prose, said the emperor, executed prompt and ample justice upon it. The Necker coterie was irritated, and Madame de Staël, engaging in some intrigues, received an order to quit France. Thenceforth she became an ardent and strenuous enemy. Nevertheless, on the return from the island of Elba, she wrote or sent to the Emperor to express in her peculiar way the enthusiasm which this wonderful event had excited in her, that she was overcome, that this last act was not that of a mortal, that it had at once raised its author to the skies. Then, returning to herself, she concluded by hinting that if the Emperor would condescend to allow the payment of the 2 millions, for which an order in her favour had already been signed by the king, her pen and her principles should be devoted for ever after to his interest. The Emperor desired she might be informed, in answer, that nothing could flatter him more highly than her approbation, because he fully appreciated her talents, but that he really was not rich enough to purchase it at that price. My new lodging described. Morning visit 21st. I had at length taken possession of the new lodging built for me instead of my former stoving room. Upon a soil constantly damp had been placed a floor, 18 feet long by 11 wide. This was surrounded by a wall of 1.5 feet in thickness, composed of a sort of loam, and which might have been destroyed with a kick of the foot. At the height of 7 feet was covered with a roof of boards, defended by a coating of paper and tar. Such were the construction and the outline of my new palace, divided into 2 apartments, one of which contained 2 beds separated by a chest of drawers, and would only afford room for a single chair. The other, at once my saloon and my library, had a single window strongly fastened up on account of the violence of the winds and rain. On the right and left of it 2 writing tables, for me and my son, on the opposite side a couch and 2 chairs. This was the whole of the furniture and accommodations. Add to this, that the aspect of the 2 windows is towards a wind constantly blowing from the same quarter, and gradually accompanied with rain, often very heavy, and which, previous to our taking possession, already forced its way through the cracks, or soaked through the walls and the roof. I was to pass the first night in these new quarters. I was indisposed, and my change of bed prevented me from sleeping. I was informed about 7 o'clock that the Emperor was going out on horseback. I replied that, not feeling myself well, I should endeavour to take some rest. But only a few minutes had elapsed when a person hastily entered my apartment, opened my curtains with an air of authority, found fault with me for being so idle, and pronounced that this ailment must be shaken off. Then, struck with the smell of the paint, the extreme smallness of the room, and the closeness of the 2 beds, decided that we could no longer be suffered to sleep huddled together in that way, that it was far too unwholesome, and that I must return to the bed in the topographical cabinet, which I ought not to abandon through false delicacy, and that if I occasioned any inconvenience there, I should be told of it. It will have been guessed that this person was the Emperor. I was, of course, soon out of bed, dressed and well. The Emperor was, however, already far off. I had to seek him in the park. After I had overtaken him, our conversation turned on the long audience he had given to Governor Wilkes the day before. He dwelt, with much good humour, on the great importance which my work seemed to have given me in the governor's eyes, and the extreme goodwill towards me with which it seemed to have inspired him. Of course, continued he, it is understood that these sentiments are to be mutual, the usual regard and fraternity of authors, as long as they do not criticize each other. And is he aware of your relationship to the venerable Las Cases? I answered that I knew nothing of the matter, but General Gorgor, who was on the other side of the Emperor, replied in the affirmative. And how do you know it yourself? Said the Emperor to me. Are you not romancing with us? The following, sire, are my proofs. Our family had been 200 years in France, when Barthélemy de las Cases flourished in Spain, but the Spanish historians all describe him as a native of the same city from which we ourselves came, that is to say, Seville. They all mention him as of an ancient family of French origin, and state his ancestors to have passed into Spain precisely at the time when our family went there. What then, you were not Spanish, he was French as well as you? Yes, sire. Let us hear all about it. Come, Sir Castellan, Sir Knight-errant, Sir Paladin, let us see you in your glory. Unroll your old parchments. Come, enjoy yourself. Sire, one of my ancestors followed Henry Count of Burgundy, who, at the head of a few crusaders, achieved the conquest of Portugal about the year 1100. He was his standard-bearer at the famous Battle of Urique, which founded the Portuguese monarchy. Afterwards we returned to France with Queen Blanche, when she came to be married to the father of Saint Louis. Sire, this is the whole. The Emperor's readings, Madame de Sévigné, Charles III, Paul and Virginia, Verroch, Rollet, Veli, Garnier. 22nd, 26th. These days were rendered unpleasant by almost incessant rain. The Emperor was only twice able to ride out in the park one morning, and once in the afternoon through our usual valley, which the weather had rendered almost impassable. Nor was it more practicable to make use of the calash. We were therefore compelled to confine ourselves to a few turns in the garden, and to share in the We worked, however, the more on this account. The Emperor regularly took excellent and long lessons in English. It is his custom to pass all the morning in reading. He reads whole works of very considerable extent regularly, throughout, without feeling in the least fatigued. He always read some part of them to me before he began his English lessons. One of them was the letters of Madame de Sévigné, the style of which is so easy, and depicts so faithfully the manners of the time. Reading The Death of Turenne and Trial of Fouquet, he observed with respect to the latter that Madame de Sévigné seemed to evince too much warmth, too much earnestness and tenderness for mere friendship. Another was Charles II, in reading whose defence of his house at Bender against the Turks. He could not help laughing and repeating, as they did, "Iron head, iron head." He asked me whether the nature of this monarch's death was a settled point. I told him I had it from the month of Gustavus III himself that he had been assassinated by his followers. Gustavus had examined his body in the vault. The ball was a pistol bullet. It had been fired very near and behind him. At the beginning of the Revolution, I was well acquainted with Gustavus III at the waters of Aix-la-Chapelle, and though I was then very young, I had more than once the honour of conversing with him. He even promised me a place in the navy if our affairs in France should turn out unfavourably. Another day, the Emperor was reading Paul and Virginia. He gave full effect to the touching passages, which were always the most simple and natural. Those which abounded with the photos, the abstract and false ideas so much in fashion when the work was published, were all, in the Emperor's opinion, cold, bad, spoiled. He said he had been infatuated with this book in his youth, but he had little personal regard for its author. He could never forgive him for having imposed on his generosity on his return from the army of Italy. Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's sensibility and delicacy, said he, were little in harmony with his charming picture of Paul and Virginia. He was a bad man. He used his wife, Didot, the printer's daughter, very ill. He was always ready to ask charity, without the least shame. On my return from the army of Italy, Bernardin came to see me, and almost immediately began to tell me of his wants. I, who in my early youth had dreamed of nothing but Paul and Virginia, and felt flattered by a confidence which I imagined was reposed in me alone, and which I attributed to my great celebrity, hastened to return his visit, and, unperceived by anyone, left on the corner of his chimney-piece a little rouleau of 25 louis. But how was I mortified on seeing everyone laugh at the delicacy of my proceedings, and on learning that such ceremony was entirely superfluous with M. Bernardin, who made it his trade to beg all comers and to receive from everybody. I always retained some little resentment towards him for having thus imposed upon me. It was otherwise with my family. Joseph allowed him a large pension, and Louis was constantly making him presents. But though the Emperor liked Paul and Virginia, he laughed, for very pity, at the studies of nature by the same author. Bernardin, said he, though versed in belles lettres, was very little a geometrician. This last work was so bad that scientific men disdained to answer it. Bernardin complained loudly of their not noticing him. The celebrated mathematician Lagrange, when speaking on this subject, always said, alluding to the Institute, if Bernardin were one of our class, if he spake our language, we would call him to order, but he belongs to the Academy, and his style is out of our line. Bernardin was complaining as usual one day to the first consul of the silence of the learned with respect to his works. Napoleon asked, "Do you understand the differential method, M. Bernardin?" "No." "Well, go and learn it, and then you will be able to answer yourself." Afterwards, when Emperor, every time he perceived Saint-Pierre, he used to say to him, "M. Bernardin, when are we to have any more Paul and my residence with Virginias or Indian cottages? You ought to supply us every 6 months." In reading Vertot's Roman Revolutions, of which in other respects the Emperor thinks highly, he found the declamations much too diffuse. This was his constant complaint against every work he took up. He had in his youth, he said, been much to blame in this respect himself. He may justly be said to have thoroughly reformed afterwards. He amused himself with striking out the superfluous phrases in Vertot, and the result was that after these erasures, the work appeared much more energetic and animated. "It would certainly be a most valuable and successful labour," said he, "if any man of taste and discernment would devote his time to reducing the principal works in our language in this manner. I know nobody but Montesquieu who would escape these caryatiaments." He often looked into Rollin, whom he thought diffuse and too credulous. Crevier, his continuator, seemed to Napoleon detestable. He complained of our classical works, and of the time which our young people are compelled to lose in reading such bad books. "They were composed by rhetoricians and mere professors," said he, "whereas such immortal subjects, the basis of all our knowledge throughout life, ought to have been written and edited by statesmen and men of the world." The emperor had excellent ideas on this subject. The want of time alone prevented him from carrying them into execution. The emperor was still more dissatisfied with our French historians. He could not bear to read any of them. Velly is rich in words and poor in meaning. His continuators are still worse. "Our history," said the emperor, "should either be in 4 or 5 volumes or in 100. He had been acquainted with Garnier, who continued Velly and Villaret. He lived in the basement of Malmaison. He was an old man of 80, and lodged in a small set of apartments on the ground floor with a little gallery. Struck with the officious attention which this good old man always evinced whenever the first consul was passing, the latter inquired who he was. On learning that it was Garnier, he comprehended his motives. He, no doubt, imagined, said the emperor pleasantly, that a first consul was his property as historian. I dare say, however, he was astonished to find consuls where he had been accustomed to see kings. Napoleon told him so himself, laughing, when he called him one day, and settled a good pension on him. From that time, said the emperor, the poor man, in the warmth of his gratitude, would gladly have written anything I pleased with all his heart. A difficulty overcome. The emperor's personal danger at Eylau, Jena. Russian, Austrian, and Prussian troops. Young Guibert Corbineau, Marshal Lessière, Duroc. 27th. About 5 o'clock the emperor went out in his calash. The evening was very fine. We drove rapidly, and the distance to be traversed is very short. The emperor made the servants slacken their pace in order to prolong the ride. As we returned, the emperor, casting his eyes on the camp, from which we were only separated by the ravine, asked why we could not pass that way, which would double the length of our ride. He was told it was impossible, and we continued our way homeward. But on a sudden, as if roused by this word impossible, which he had so often said was not French, he ordered the ground to be reconnoitred. We all got out of the carriage, which proceeded empty towards the difficult points. We saw it clear every obstacle, and returned home in triumph, as if we had just doubled our possessions. During dinner, and afterwards, the conversation turned on various deeds of arms. The Grand Marshal said that what had most struck him in the life of the emperor happened at Eylau, when attended only by some officers of his staff. A column of 4,000 or 5,000 Russians came almost in contact with him. The emperor was on foot. The Prince of Neuchâtel instantly ordered up the horses. The emperor gave him a reproachful look, then sent orders to a battalion of his guard to advance, which was a good way behind and standing still. As the Russians advanced, he repeated several times, "What audacity! What audacity!" At the sight of the grenadiers of the guard, the Russians stopped short. It was high time they should, as Bertrand said. The emperor had never stirred. All who surrounded him had been much alarmed. The emperor had heard this account without making any observation, but when it was finished, he said that one of the finest manoeuvres he remembered was that which he executed at Ekmol. Unfortunately, he did not proceed or give any particulars. "Success in war," said he, "depends so much on quick-sightedness and on seizing the right moment, that the Battle of Austerlitz, which was so completely won, would have been lost if I had attacked 6 hours sooner." The Russians showed themselves on that occasion such excellent troops as they have never appeared since. The Russian army of Austerlitz would not have lost the Battle of the Moskowa. Marengo, said the emperor, was the battle in which the Austrians fought best. Their troops behaved admirably there, but that was the grave of their valour. It has never since been seen. The Prussians at Jena did not make such a resistance as was expected from their reputation. As to the multitudes of 1814 and 1815, they were mere rabble compared to the real soldiers of Marengo, Austerlitz, and Jena. The night before the Battle of Jena, the emperor said he had run the greatest risk. He might then have disappeared without his fate being clearly known. He had approached the bivouacs of the enemy in the dark to reconnoitre them. He had only a few officers with him. The opinion which was then entertained of the Prussian army kept everyone on the alert. It was that the Prussians were particularly given to nocturnal attacks. As the emperor returned, he was fired at by the first sentinel of his camp. This was a signal for the whole line. He had no resource but to throw himself flat on his face until the mistake was discovered. But his principal apprehension was that the Prussian line, which was very near him, would act in the same manner. At Marengo, the Austrian soldiers had not forgotten the conqueror of Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli. His name had much influence over them, but they were far from thinking he was present. They believed he was dead. Care had been taken to persuade them that he had perished in Egypt, that the first consul, of whom they heard talk, was only his brother. This report had gained so much credit everywhere that Napoleon was under the necessity of appearing in public at Milan in order to refute it. After these anecdotes, the emperor proceeded to mention a great number of his officers and aides de camp, distributing praise and censure amongst them as he went on. He knew them all thoroughly. Two of the circumstances which had most affected him on the field of battle, he said, were the deaths of young Guibert and General Corbineau. At Aboukir, a bullet went quite through the breast of the former, without killing him instantly. The emperor, after saying a few words to him, was obliged, by the violence of his feelings, to leave him. The other was carried away, crushed, annihilated by a cannonball at Eylau, before the emperor's face, whilst he was giving him some orders. The emperor spoke also of the last moments of Marshal Lannes, the valiant Duke of Montebello, so justly called the Orlando of the army, who, when visited by the emperor on his deathbed, seemed to forget his own situation and to care only for him, whom he loved above everything. The emperor had the highest esteem for him. "He was for a long time a mere fighting man," said he, "but he afterwards became an officer of the first talents." Someone then said, he should like to know what line of conduct Lannes would have pursued in these latter times if he had lived. "We have learned," said the emperor, "not to swear to anything. Yet I cannot conceive that it could have been possible for him to deviate from the path of duty and honour. Besides, it is hard to imagine that he could have existed. With all his bravery, he would unquestionably have got killed in some of the last affairs, or at least sufficiently wounded to be laid up out of the centre and influence of events. And if he had remained disposable, he was a man capable of changing the whole face of affairs by his own weight and influence." The emperor next mentioned Duroc, on whose character and private life he dwelt some time. Duroc, concluded he, had lively, tender, and concealed passions, little corresponding with the coldness of his manner. It was long before I knew this, so exact and regular was his service. It was not until my day was entirely closed and finished, and I was enjoying repose, that Duroc's work began. Chance, or some accident, could alone have made me acquainted with his character. He was a pure and virtuous man, utterly disinterested and extremely generous. The emperor said that on the opening of the campaign at Dresden he lost 2 men who were extremely valuable to him, and in the most foolish manner in the world. These were Bessieres and Duroc. When we went to see Duroc, after he had received his mortal wound, he attempted to hold out some hopes to him, but Duroc, who did not deceive himself, only replied by begging him to make them give him opium. The emperor, excessively affected, could not venture to remain long with him, and tore himself from this distressing spectacle. One of the company then reminded the emperor that on leaving Duroc he went and walked up and down by himself before his tent. No one durst accost him. But, some essential measures being requisite against the following day, someone at length ventured to go and ask him where the battery of the guard was to be placed. "Ask me nothing till tomorrow," was the emperor's answer. At this recollection, the emperor, with an apparent effort, began abruptly to talk of something else. Duroc was one of those persons whose value is never known till they are lost. This was, after his death, the common expression of the court and city, and the unanimous sentiment everywhere. He was a native of Nancy, in the department of La Meurthe. The origin of his fortune has been related above. Napoleon found him in the train at the siege of Toulon, and immediately interested himself for him. His attachment to him increased every day, and it might be said that they never more separated. I have elsewhere mentioned that I have heard the emperor say that throughout his career, Duroc was the only person who had possessed his unreserved confidence and to whom he could freely unburden his mind. Duroc was not a brilliant character, but he possessed an excellent judgment, and he rendered essential services, which, owing to their nature as well as to his reserve, were little heard of. Duroc loved the emperor for himself. It was rather to the individual, personally, that his devotion was attached than to the monarch. In being made the confidant of his prince's feelings, he had acquired the art, and perhaps the right, of mitigating and directing them. How often has he whispered to people struck with consternation by the anger of the emperor, "Let him have his way, he speaks from his feelings, not according to his judgment, nor as he will act tomorrow. What a servant, what a friend, what a treasure! How many storms he has soothed, how many rash orders, given in the moment of irritation, has he omitted to execute, knowing that his master would thank him the next day for the omission." The emperor had accommodated himself to this sort of tacit arrangement, and on that account gave way the more readily to those violent bursts of temper, which relieve by the vent they afford to passions. Duroc died in the most deplorable manner, at a very critical moment. His death was another of the fatalities of Napoleon's career. The day after the Battle of Vauchennes, towards evening, the skirmish of Reichenbach had just ended. The firing had ceased. Duroc was on the top of an eminence, apart from the troops, conversing with General Kirchner and observing the retreat of the last ranks of the enemy. A piece was levelled at this glittering group, and the fatal ball killed both the generals. Duroc had more influence over the emperor's resolutions than is imagined. His death was probably, in this respect, a national calamity. There is reason to think that if he had survived, the armistice of Dresden, which ruined us, would not have taken place. We should have pushed on to the Oder and beyond it. The enemy would then have instantly acceded to peace, and we should have escaped their machinations, their intrigues, and, above all, the tedious base and atrocious perfidy of the Austrian cabinet, which has ended in our destruction. At a subsequent period, Duroc might still have exerted an influence over other great events, and probably changed the face of affairs. Finally, even at a later conjuncture, at the time of Napoleon's fall, he would never have separated his destiny from that of the emperor. He would have been with us at St. Helena, and this aid alone would have sufficed to counterbalance all the horrible vexations with which Napoleon was studiously oppressed. Bessieres, of the Department of the Lot, was thrown by the Revolution into the career of arms. He commenced as a private soldier in the Constitutional Guard of Louis XVI. Afterwards, having attained the rank of captain of chasseurs, he attracted the commander-in-chief of the army of Italy by acts of extraordinary personal bravery, and when the general formed his corps of guides, he chose Bessieres to take the command of them. Such was the beginning of Bessieres and the origin of his fortunes. From that instant, we find him always at the head of the consular or imperial guard, in charges of the reserve, deciding the battle, or profiting by the victory. His name is gloriously connected with all our great battles. Bessieres rose with the man who had distinguished him, and shared abundantly in the favours which the emperor distributed. He was made a Marshal of the Empire, Duke of Istria, Colonel of the Cavalry of the Guard. His qualities developing themselves as he rose, proved him always equal to his fortune. Bessieres always continued good, humane, and generous, of antique loyalty and integrity, and, whether considered as a citizen or as a soldier, an honest, worthy man. He often made use of the high favour in which he stood, to do extraordinary services, and acts of kindness even to people of very different ways of think to his. I know people who, if they have a spark of gratitude in them, will confirm my assertion, and can bear testimony to his noble, elevated sentiments. Bessieres was adored by the guards, in the midst of whom he passed his life. At the Battle of Wagram, a ball struck him off his horse, without doing him any farther injury. A mournful cry arose from the whole battalion, upon which Napoleon remarked, the next time he saw him, "Bessieres, the ball which struck you drew tears from all my guard. Return thanks to it. It ought to be very dear to you." He was less fortunate at the opening of the campaign of Saxony. On the very eve of the Battle of Lutzen, a trilling engagement occurred, in which, having advanced into the very midst of the skirmishers, he was shot dead on the spot by a mask ball in the breast. Thua, after living like Bayard, he died like Turenne. I had conversed with him a little before this fatal event. Chance had brought us together by ourselves in a private box at the theatre. After talking of public affairs which deeply interested him, for he idolized his country, his last words, as he left me, were that he was to set out for the army that night, and hoped we should meet again. "But at the present crisis," said he, "with our young soldiers, we leaders must not spare ourselves." Alas, he was never to return. Bessieres was sincerely attached to the emperor. He almost worshipped him. He, like Duroc, would certainly never have abandoned his person or his fortunes. And one would really think that fate, which proved so decidedly hostile to Napoleon in his latter days, had resolved to deprive him of the sweetest consolation by thus removing two such valuable friends, and at the same time to prevent these faithful servants from acquiring the very highest claim to glory, that of gratitude to the unfortunate. The emperor caused the remains of these two men, whom he much esteemed, and by whom he knew himself to be beloved in return, to be carried to the Invalids at Paris. He intended extraordinary honours for them, of which subsequent events deprived them. But history, whose pages are far more imperishable than marble or bronze, has consecrated them and secured them forever from oblivion. Study of English. Reflections. Ride. Mired horse. 21st. Our days passed, as may be supposed, in an excessive stupid monotony. Ennui, reflection, and melancholy were our formidable enemies, occupation our great and only refuge. The emperor followed his pursuits with great regularity. English was become an affair of importance to him. It was now near a fortnight since he took his first lesson, and from that moment he had devoted some hours every day, beginning at noon, to that study, sometimes with truly admirable ardour, sometimes with visible disgust, an alternative which kept me in the greatest anxiety. I considered success as of the greatest importance, and every day dreaded to see him abandon the ground gained on the day preceding, and consequently that I should be regarded as having wearied him with the most tedious labour, without having produced the fortunate result I had promised myself. On the other hand, I was also spurred on by the consciousness that I was approaching the goal at which I aimed. The attainment of the English language was a real and serious conquest to the emperor. Formerly, he said, it had cost him 100,000 crowns a year, merely for translations, and how did he know whether he had them exact, whether they were faithful? Now that we were imprisoned, as it were, in the midst of this language, surrounded by its productions, all the great changes and questions which the emperor had given rise to on the continent had been taken up by the English on the opposite side, and in their works presented so many new faces to him, to which he had hitherto been a stranger. It may be added that French books were scarce with us, that the emperor knew them all, and had read them even to satiety, whilst we could easily procure a multitude of English ones altogether new to him. Besides, to learn the language of a foreigner always prepossesses him in our favour. It is a satisfaction to one's self, it facilitates intercourse, and forms in a certain degree the commencement of a sort of connection between the parties. However this may be, I began to perceive the limits of our difficulties. I anticipated the moment when the emperor would have got through all the inevitable disagreeables incident to beginners. But let anyone form an idea, if possible, of what the scholastic study of conjugations, declensions, and articles must have been to him. It could never have been accomplished without great courage on the scholar's side and some degree of artifice on the part of the master. He often asked me whether he did not deserve the ferula, of which he now comprehended the vast utility in schools. He declared, jestingly, that he should have made much greater progress himself had he stood in fear of correction. He complained of not having improved, but, in reality, the progress he had made would have been extraordinary in anyone. The more grand, rapid, and comprehensive the mind is, the less it is capable of dwelling on regular minute details. The emperor, who discovered wonderful facility in apprehending all that regarded the philosophy of the language, evinced very little capacity for retaining its material mechanism. He had a quick understanding and a very bad memory. This vexed him much. He conceived that he did not get on. Whenever I could subject the matters in question to any regular law or analogy, they were classed and comprehended in an instant. The scholar even preceded the master in his applications and deductions. But as to learning by heart and retaining the gross elements of the language, it was a most difficult affair. He was constantly confounding one thing with another, and it would have been thought too fastidious to require too scrupulous a regularity at first. Another difficulty was that with the same letters, the same vowels as ours, a totally different pronunciation is required. The scholar would allow of none but ours, and the master would have rendered the difficulties and disagreeables tenfold had he required any better. Besides, the scholar, even in his own language, was incorrigibly addicted to maiming proper names and foreign words. He pronounced them quite at his own discretion, and when once they had passed his lips, they always remained the same, in spite of everything, because he had thus got them, once for all, lodged, as it were, in his head. The same thing happened with respect to most of our English words, and the master found it best to have the prudence and patience to let it pass, leaving it to time to rectify by degrees, if it should ever be possible, all these defects. From these concurring circumstances actually sprang a new language. It was understood by me alone, it is true, but it procured the emperor the pleasure of reading English, and he could, in the strictest sense, make himself understood by writing in that language. This was a great deal. It was everything. In the meantime, the emperor regularly continued his campaigns of Egypt with the Grand Marshal. My campaign of Italy had long been finished. We were always touching and retouching it, with respect to its topographical form, the arrangement of the chapters, the division of the paragraphs. The small part of it that remained in my hands will be seen in the course of this work. From time to time he also dictated separate parts to Messrs. Gourgaud and Montholon. To all this work he added very little exercise, a walk now and then, sometimes a ride in the Orlash, scarcely ever on horseback. On the 30th, however, he chose to return to our Valley of Silence, which we had long deserted. We were near the middle of the vale. The passage was stopped up with dead bushes and a kind of bar to restrain cattle. The servant, the faithful Ali, dismounted as usual to clear the way for us. We passed on, but whilst the servant was engaged in assisting us, his horse had strayed from him, and when he attempted to catch him, ran away. A great quantity of rain had fallen, and the horse sank into a quagmire similar to that in which the emperor, a few days after our arrival at Longwood, had stuck so tenaciously as to make it doubtful whether he would not remain in it. The servant ran after us to say that he must remain for the purpose of disengaging his horse. We were in a very difficult, narrow road, riding one by one. It was not until some time after that the emperor heard us mention to one another the accident of the servant. He found great fault because we had not waited for him, and desired the Grand Marshal and General Gourgaud to return for him. The emperor dismounted to wait for them, and ascended a little elevation on which he looked like a figure on a pedestal in the midst of ruins. He had the bridle of his horse passed round his arm, and began to whistle an air. Mute nature echoed the strains, but only to the barren desert. Yet, thought I, a short time ago how many sceptres he wielded, how many crowns belonged to him, how many kings were at his feet. It is true, said I, that in the eyes of those who approach him, who daily see and hear him, he is still greater than ever. This is the sentiment, the opinion of all about him. We serve him with no less ardour. We love him with greater affection than ever. But now the Grand Marshal and Gourgaud arrived. They assisted the emperor to mount again, and we went on. These gentlemen acknowledged that without their assistance the horse could never have been saved. The united efforts of all three had barely sufficed to disengage him. A considerable time afterwards, turning an elbow of the road, the emperor observes that the servant had not followed, and said they ought to have remained till they had found he was in a condition to come on. They thought he had stayed behind to clean his horse a little. In the course of our ride at several other turnings, the emperor repeated the same observation. We arrived at the Grand Marshal's, went in and rested there a few minutes as we came out. The emperor asked whether the servant had passed on. No one had seen him. When we arrived at Longwood, his first question was whether the man had returned. He had been at home some time, having returned by a different road. I may perhaps have dwelt somewhat too much on this trifling circumstance, but I did so because it appeared to me perfectly characteristic. In this domestic solitude, the reader will find it difficult to recognize the insensible, obdurate, wicked, cruel monster, the tyrant of whom he has so often and so long been told N.B. I have mentioned above that I should introduce the fragments of the campaign of Italy which have remained in my hands. Having now arrived at the end of a month, I will insert a few chapters of them. On my return to France, through that fatal event which placed me at my own disposal, my motives for retaining to myself alone the fragments of the campaign of Italy, which I had preserved by the Emperor's consent, no longer existing, and the detention of my papers by the English ministry leaving me no means of publishing anything on St. Helena, I distributed some of these fragments, attaching no other condition to their being made public than that of distinctly declaring that they were mere rough drafts, first dictations, which have, no doubt, subsequently undergone great alterations. Now that the restoration of my papers has enabled me to publish the Journal of St. Helena, I have thought of collecting all these fragments of the campaign of Italy, conceiving that they will not be uninteresting to those who like to compare the first sketch with the more deliberate ideas, and particularly as I learn from the depositories of the manuscript of these campaigns that it was the Emperor's will that the whole should be splendidly published, with maps, plans, and dedicated to his son, and have every reason to believe that it will still be a long time before society can be gratified with this publication. I shall therefore insert the little I possess, which is 7 chapters out of 22, either at the conclusion of the months or in the course of the journal itself, if I find it flag. I now present the first of these fragments, Vendémiaire, the Battle of Monotony, and part of the 3rd chapter on the topography of Italy, the 13th of Vendémiaire. N.B. All the words in italics are corrections made in the original manuscript by Napoleon's own hand. I. Constitution of the year 3. The fall of the municipality of the 31st of May, of the party of Danton and Robespierre, produced eventually the fall of the Jacobins and the end of the revolutionary government. Afterwards, the convention was successively governed by factions which were never able to acquire any preponderance. Its principles varied every month. The interior of the Republic was afflicted by a horrible system of reaction. The national domains ceased to find purchasers, and the credit of the assignats sinking daily lower. The armies were unpaid, requisitions, and the maximum had alone kept them supplied. The magazines were empty. The soldier was no longer sure even of bread. The recruiting of the army, the laws respecting which had been enforced with the greatest rigour under the revolutionary government, had ceased. The armies continued to obtain great advantages because they were more numerous than ever, but they were suffering daily losses which there were no means of repairing. The foreign party supported by the pretext of the restoration of the Bourbons gained strength every day. The saloons were open, people discoursed there fearlessly, the communications with foreign parts were become more easy, the destruction of the Republic was undisguisedly preparing. The revolution had lost its novelty, it had alienated many interests, an iron hand had severely oppressed individuals. Many crimes had been committed. They were now most vindictively recalled to memory, and the public indignation was daily more violently excited against all those who had been members of the government, filled official situations, or participated in any manner whatsoever in the triumphs of the revolution. Pic-Begrou, the first general of the Republic, had been gained over. He was the son of a labourer of Franche-Comté, and had been a minim friar in his youth at the College of Brienne. He sold himself to the royal party, to whom he surrendered the successes of the operations of his army. The enemies of the Republic had not many proselytes in the army. It remained faithful to the principles of the Revolution, for which it had shed so much blood and gained so many victories. All parties were tired of the Convention, nay, it was tired of itself. Its mission had been the establishment of a constitution. It perceived at length that the safety of the nation and its own required it, without delay, to fulfil its principal object. On the 25th of June, 1795, it adopted the Constitution, known under the title of the Constitution of the Year 3. The government was entrusted to 5 persons, under the name of the Directory, the legislature to 2 councils, called the Council of the 500 and the Council of the Ancient. This constitution was submitted to the acceptance of the people called together in primary assembly. I. Sue. Additional laws to the Constitution. It was a prevalent opinion that the fall of the Constitution of 1794 was to be attributed to that law of the Constituent Assembly which excluded its members from the legislature. The Convention did not fall into the same error. It annexed 2 additional laws to the Constitution, by which it prescribed that 2/3 of the new legislature should be composed of members of the Convention, and that the electoral assemblies of departments should, on this occasion, only have to elect 1/3 of the 2 councils. The Convention farther prescribed that these 2 additional laws should be submitted to the acceptance of the people as inseparable parts of the Constitution. The discontent was thenceforth general. The foreign party in particular found all its schemes baffled by these arrangements. It had flattered itself that the 2 councils would have been entirely composed of new men, strangers to the revolution, or even partly of those who had suffered by it, and thence it hoped to effect a counter-revolution through the influence of the legislature itself. This party did not want for plausible reasons to conceal the true grounds of its discontent. They alleged that the rights of the people were disregarded, since the convention, which had been appointed only to establish a constitution, now usurped the powers of an electoral body by giving to its members, of its own accord, the powers of a legislative body, that it was plain that the convention knew that it was acting contrary to the intention of the people, because it imposed on the primary assemblies the arbitrary condition of voting at once on the aggregate of the constitution and its additional laws. The convention ought only to will that which was the will of the people. Why did it not allow them to vote separately on the constitution and the additional laws? Because it knew that the additional laws would be unanimously rejected. As to the constitution, in itself, it was preferable, no doubt, to what existed, and all parties were agreed on that point. Some, indeed, wanted to have a president instead of 5 directors, others would have desired a more popular council, but in general this new constitution was favourably regarded. As to the foreign faction, which was managed by secret committees, it concerned itself but little about forms of government which it did not intend to support. It only studied, in this constitution, how to avail itself thereof for the purpose of operating a counter-revolution, and whatever tended to wrest authority out of the hands of the convention and its partisans was agreeable to this party. 3. The additional laws are rejected by the sections of Paris. The 48 sections of Paris assembled, forming as many tribunes, to which the most violent orators immediately hastened: La Harpe, Cerisy, Lacrevel the Younger, Vaublanc, Regnault. It required little ability to excite all minds against the convention, but several of these orators developed great talents. The capital was thus thrown into a ferment. After the 9th of Thermidor, the National Guard had been organized. It had been made an object to keep the Jacobins out of it, but this had led to the opposite extreme, and a considerable number of counter-revolutionists were accordingly found in its ranks. This National Guard consisted of upwards of 40,000 men armed and clothed. It shared fully in the exasperation of the sections against the convention, and the additional laws were rejected throughout Paris. The sections appeared, one after another, at the bar of the convention, and there warmly declared their sentiments. The convention, however, still believed that all this agitation would subside as soon as the provinces should have manifested their opinion by accepting the constitution and the additional laws. It thought this commotion in the capital was like those riots so common in London, and of which instances often happened at Rome at the time of the Comitia. It proclaimed on the 28th of September the acceptance of the constitution and additional laws by the majority of the primary assemblies, but on the following day the sections of Paris appointed deputies to form a central assembly of electors, which met at the Haute-Con. IV. Armed resistance of the sections of Paris. The sections had calculated their own strength and appreciated the weakness of the convention. This assembly of electors was an assembly of insurgents. The convention annulled the assembly of the Odeon, declared it illegal, and ordered its committees to dissolve it by force. On the 10th of Vendémiaire, the armed power proceeded to the Odeon and executed this order. The people collected in the Place de l'Odeon uttered some murmurs and indulged in some railing, but offered no resistance. The decree of the convention for shutting up the Odeon excited the indignation of all the sections. That of Le Pelletier, of which the central place was the convent of the Fidèles, St. Thomas, appeared to take the lead in this movement. By a decree of the convention, it was ordered that the place of its sittings should be closed, the assembly dissolved, and the section disarmed. On the 12th of Vendémiaire, 3rd October, at 7 or 8 in the evening, General Menou, accompanied by the representatives of the people, who were commissioners to the Army of the Interior, proceeded with a numerous body of troops to the place of meeting of the section Le Pelletier to carry into execution the decree of the convention. The infantry, cavalry, and artillery were all crowded together in the Rue Vivienne, at the extremity of which is the convent of the Fidèles, St. Thomas. The sectionaries occupied the windows of the houses of this street. Several of their battalions drew up in order of battle in the court of the convent, and the military force, which General Menou commanded, found itself compromised. The committee of the section had declared itself a representation of the sovereign people. In the exercise of its functions, it refused to obey the orders of the convention, and, after spending an hour in useless negotiations, General Menou and the commissioners of the convention withdrew by a species of capitulation without having dispersed or disarmed the meeting. V. Menou is deprived of the command of the Army of the Interior. The section, thus victorious, declared itself permanent, sent deputations to all the other sections, boasted its success, and hastened the organization necessary for securing the success of its resistance. Preparations commenced for the 13th of Vendémiaire. General Bonaparte, who had been for some months attached to the directors of the movements of the French armies, was in a box at the theatre Feydeau when some of his friends informed him of the singular events that were passing. He was curious to witness the particulars of so grand a spectacle. Seeing the conventional troops repulsed, he hastened to the assembly to observe the effect of this intelligence, and to trace the developments and character which would there be given to it. The convention was in the greatest agitation. The representatives with the army, in order to exculpate themselves, loudly accused Menou. The consequences of his want of skill were ascribed to treason. He was placed under arrest. Various representatives then appeared at the tribune. They described the extent of the danger. The news, which every moment arrived from the sections, showed but too plainly how great the peril actually was. Every member recommended the general who possessed his confidence. Those who had been at Toulon and with the army of Italy, and the members of the Committee of Public Safety, who were in daily communication with Napoleon, proposed him as more capable than any other person, from the promptness of his coup d'état and the energy of his character, of bringing them safely through the present danger. Messengers were sent into the city to seek him. Napoleon, who had heard all that had been said, and knew what was in agitation, deliberated with himself more than half an hour on the course most eligible for him to pursue. A deadly war was breaking out between the Convention and Paris. Would it be prudent to declare himself to speak in the name of all France? Who would dare to enter the lists alone as the champion of the Convention? Victory itself would be attended with a degree of odium, whilst defeat would devote the unsuccessful combatant to the eternal execration of future generations. Why thus devote himself to be the scapegoat of crimes to which he had been a stranger? Why voluntarily expose himself to add, in a few hours, one more to the list of those names which men shudder to pronounce? But, on the other hand, if the Convention should sink, what would become of the great truths of our revolution? Our numerous victories, our blood so often shed, would then be only disgraceful actions. The foreigner, whom we had often vanquished, would triumph, and load us with his contempt. An insolent, unnatural crew would reappear triumphant, would reproach us with our crimes, would indulge their revenge, and rule us like helots by foreign force. Thus, the defeat of the Convention would place a victorious crown on the brows of the foreigner, and seal the disgrace and slavery of the nation. This sentiment, the ardour of 25, confident in his own powers and his destiny, prevailed. He made up his mind, and went to the committee, to which he represented with energy the impossibility of directing so important an operation, whilst subject to the interference of 3 representatives, who, in fact, exercised all power and impeded all the operations of the general. He added that he had witnessed all the proceedings of the Rue Vivienne, that the commissioners had been chiefly to blame, and had, nevertheless, acted the part of accusers in the assembly with triumphant success. Struck with these arguments, but unable to deprive the commissioners of their functions without a long discussion in the assembly, the committee, to conciliate matters, for they had no time to lose, resolved to select the general from the assembly itself. With this view, it proposed Barras to the Convention as general-in-chief, and gave the command to Napoleon, who thus found himself relieved from the 3 commissioners, without their having anything to complain of. As soon as Napoleon found himself invested with the command of the forces destined to protect the assembly, he went to one of the cabinets of the Tuileries, where Menou remained, to obtain from him the necessary information as to the force and position of the troops and artillery. The army consisted of only 5,000 soldiers of all descriptions, with 40 pieces of cannon, then at the sablons, guarded by 15 men. It was an hour after midnight. Napoleon instantly dispatched a major of the 21st Light Horse, Murat, with 300 cavalry, to proceed with all possible expedition to the sablons, and bring off the artillery to the garden of the Tuileries. 1 moment more would have been too late. This officer, on arriving at the sablons at 2 o'clock, fell in with the head of a column of the section Le Pelletier, come for the purpose of carrying off the artillery, but his troops being cavalry, and the ground a plain, the section retreated, and at 6 in the morning the 40 guns entered the Tuileries. VEE. Dispositions for the attack and defence of the Tuileries. From 6 o'clock to 9, Napoleon visited all the posts, and placed this artillery at the head of the Pont Louis XVI, of the Pont Hauroir, of the Rue de Rohan, at the Cul-de-Sac Dauphin, in the Rue Saint-Honorat, at the Pont au Nom. He entrusted the custody of the guns to officers worthy of confidence. All the matches were lighted, and the whole of the little army was distributed at the different posts or in reserve at the Garden and the Place Carrousel. The Général beat throughout Paris, and the National Guards formed at all the débouches, thus surrounding the palace and gardens. Their drums carried their insolence so far as to come and beat the Général on the Carrousel and the Place Louis XV. The danger was imminent. 40,000 National Guards, well armed and trained, presented themselves as the enemies of the Convention